This is Arise, the Honest Man's podcast. Most welcome. My name is Karuna Avatar Das, and with me is Jai Jagannath and Kishore Gopal. What is this about? Real men arising. To end the silence around us about the chains that bind us. To dispel the darkness of illusion with luminous spiritual technologies. To finally become the hero within us all. So, Peter Pandemic. What does that mean?
Everyone should know that the inspiration for the title of the show, it comes from Karuna Avatar. It was very clever. But this was a topic that I stumbled upon, I don't know, maybe a year ago. There was a book that I stumbled upon called The Peter Pan Syndrome. And it was written by a psychoanalyst named, I think his name was Dr. Dan Kiley. I haven't read through the book, to be honest, but I stumbled upon this book and thought it was a fascinating concept that, basically men not being able to grow up or suffering basically from a protracted adolescence. And he kind of coined this term, the Peter Pan syndrome, and it got popularity after he came out with this book called the full title of his book is, let me see real quick, The Peter Pan Syndrome. I forget it had like a tagline that was really, well, I wouldn't say appealing. Yeah, men who have never grown up. That was the tagline of the book. And then after this book came out, there was like a lot of pop psychology books that followed it. So I thought it was just an interesting topic because I feel that in some ways I suffered from a protracted adolescence. I don't even know if I've fully grown up yet, but that's beside the point. Maybe we'll get to that throughout the course of this podcast. So I wanted to, I imagine that my feeling is shared. It's a shared feeling. So I'm interested to explore this kind of idea. To get into it, what I thought we might start with is the Peter Pan movie. So I guess I'm assuming that we've all seen that movie before. I mean, I grew up with it as a kid in Disney. Did you all see Peter Pan growing up? You know this movie? Know it well? Yes? Karuna Avatar, how about you? You've seen Peter Pan? I don't know if you can. Are you able to hear us?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's been a while. But yeah.
Okay, his connection's a little. We can hear you, but it's a little broken. It's all right. Yeah, we're with you. Okay, for those who don't know, Karuna Avatar is like in the middle of a forest.
Okay, just like disclaimer.
Yeah.
Yeah, disclaimer. It's a little hairy here connection wise, so we're just kind of holding thumbs and hoping for the best. Did that come through okay?
It did come through. It's just a little delayed. So let's say we'll try our best. And if it's not going well, we'll have to reschedule this episode so that we have clear audio. My first question is, in the Peter Pan movie, where do you see yourself? Like, where would you place yourself in the movie today as you stand now? Where do you place yourself in the story of Peter Pan? And why would you place yourself there? And do you consider that a good thing or a bad thing? So it's like a 3-part question. Where do you see yourself in the story, the Peter Pan's, storyline? And because I'm sure we've all had movies that we've appreciated and that we've identified with characters vicariously. So where do you see yourself, if you can draw that movie to memory, where do you see yourself in the storyline? Why do you see yourself there? And is that a good or bad thing? That's the first question that I have before we get into some of the details of what this syndrome indicates.
Okay, Kishore, putting you on the spot.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, hopefully this works.
Be honest. This is called the Honest Man's Podcast.
No, yeah, I'm just trying to remember the movie. I mean, obviously my first answer would be one of the Lost Boys. that would be my initial answer. I again, my memory is kind of fuzzy. If I remember correctly, there was like the older brother. What I don't remember his name. There was one boy who I can't. I don't know if I'm remembering correctly, but he was like in the beginning. He was kind of like not into it. He was like, we should go. We have to go to school. We have to do this. We have to do that. But over time, he eventually got like, sucked into the life of the Lost Boys. So I feel like I identified a little bit more with that one, just because I don't, it's obviously easy to just be like, yeah, I'm totally just like a lost boy, but truthfully, I am trying to like, move forward in my life, but there is that kind of, there is that kind of lingering desire, to remain in the kind of like freedom of ignorance of responsibility, and so I feel like that's kind of what I identify with in the Peter Pan theme, is that it's like this kind of like inertia of like stepping out of that familiarity of living as a as a child, basically, that kind of mentality of like freedom of engagement with the material energy, and not being cognizant of the consequences of how you use your time, how you use your energy, and so that I feel like that's kind of more accurate realistically of the position that I feel I'm in now.
Nice. Karuna.
Yeah, in a similar vein, I would say that I would be one of the Lost Boys for sure, but with like a hella guilty conscience, like bogging me down, being like just feeling completely. I would be one of the Lost Boys with a serious experience of cognitive dissonance. Yeah, just not being able to indulge in the experience of apparent like freedom and freedom of responsibility and carelessness, because it's like it's kind of like, similar to Kishore, I also have a very sincere desire to progress in life and to become a proper man. But there is just so much trepidation and apprehension, because I look ahead at all of the complexities and all the things that can possibly go wrong. And it's not that, but that's just life, right? So it's not really kind of like being in denial of life and what it is. It's more a case of feeling like I don't actually know if I'm capable and properly qualified to deal with all of it, and therefore it's this feeling of like maybe this sort of simple carefree life is an option, but at the same time it's not, because we have to shoulder some sort of burden. There's just no other way to lead a virtuous life than to do that, to take proper responsibility. So I guess the essence of it is feeling like, I just don't know if I'm going to be capable of dealing with all of the suffering and difficulty that life is going to be throwing at me, relying on my own just qualification or abilities, with Krishna's mercy out of the picture, not in consideration. Does that make sense?
Yes. So what I'm hearing, and I think I can relate to this feeling as well, is that we're a lost boy, but we're more like the older brother archetype. I also don't remember his name, but definitely that older brother archetype where he wasn't. I also recall he wasn't down with that whole Never Neverland life until toward the end of the movie. So we're kind of having this tension between us that we want to move forward and do the responsible adult thing, but we're kind of caught in the quagmire of cycles of protracted adolescence that we feel unable to escape. So what do you think is the cause of this trepidation, using your word, or kind of inability to move forward? What are some of the major causes, maybe on a subjective level? I'm going to read a little bit here about where these different psychoanalysts, what they have attributed to this problem, which I also find it interesting. Man, we can come back to this later. But this problem apparently affects men disproportionately also. They said it's kind of rare amongst women, but it's particularly found amongst men, which I also found a little bit interesting and telling. But some of the causes of this issue, they say some psychoanalysts links this syndrome with overprotective parents and the lack of life skills, which create anxiety in adulthood. There are a few other things here, but what do you think about this? I just have to say, as an aside, a lot of these qualities that I get from these psychology pages, they're so broad that I'm like, this sounds like literally everyone I know. Like they're like super broad and kind of non-specific. So if you have to go and get an assessment, you can literally have anything or have about just about everything. So I guess I'm kind of interested in the subjective reasons for which you think has caused you, and I also give my own experience, to kind of be stuck in this cycle, which disallows forward movement in terms of the responsible adult life.
Yeah. Well, just in response to that, to what you'd brought up there from what you'd read, I think that there's certainly there's definitely a degree of that. Like I feel, because mothers have the tendency to just want to nurture and to keep their children away from suffering and discomfort as much as possible. So certainly from my mother's side, I've definitely felt like pretty much just, I guess, spoiled by just a lot of comfort, and you could almost just, let's just keep it at comfort. And then, from my father's side, like I've experienced him being just sort of like very, very overbearing in many ways, and not necessarily like, like his idea of how things should be and should not be was such a like heavy weight in my consciousness for such a long time. And it didn't actually allow me to sort of like develop my own independent capabilities and like way of interacting with the world, because it's just like I've been overwhelmed by the way that I think it should be, but then at the same time, that's not something that I necessarily resonate with. And then I'm sort of like stuck in this middle zone of like, is this really how to go about life? But then at the same time, just, feeling differently. So I definitely think that there's an extent of, I identify with that, I'll say.
Okay, sure. Causes, subjective introspections concerning the causes about moving forward in adulthood.
I think the kind of life skills, lack of life skills, resonated with me. I think that as generations go on, this kind of culture of life skills is kind of lost. It's like, you don't really acquire. I mean, I guess it depends on your parents. For me particularly, it's like my mom was taking care of all 5 of us by herself, so she didn't exactly have time for that kind of stuff. She was working. She's been working full time for like 30 years. So, but I think that kind of stood out for me because, it's like there were a lot of things that I had to learn on my own. And obviously, when you have to learn things by yourself, you don't tend to learn them properly. It takes a little bit more time. And so that kind of, it gives you a little bit of a how do you say, handicap, for being able to like move quickly through life. It's kind of gives you like when you experience challenges, instead of kind of like experiencing the challenges and moving forward, you kind of plateau for a little bit. And you kind of have to be like, wait, okay, so this is what happened. This is where I went. How do I, it's like, it's a slower process. It kind of slows down the process of being able to, how to say, I can't think of the right word, assimilate, the things that you're learning and experiencing in life. And so without that, I feel like, yeah, you tend to have a little bit less, or I tended to have a little bit less confidence in being able to like go out. Okay, I can go out and like get a job, or go out and do this, or go out and do that, because it was like I wasn't really sure what the extent of my capabilities, because I didn't have the experience of using them, you can say. And so that was kind of what resonated with me, the kind of lack of life skills, so to speak. And I don't find that I was particularly sheltered. Obviously, yeah, that the nature of the mother is there for sure. So you tend to have a more softer nature. And so there's not as much of that drive to like go out and like conquer the world, And so, so I think that's also there. But yeah, the kind of life skills resonate with me a little bit more.
I was thinking that on a personal experience, that our generation, like millennials and Gen Z, we don't have a lot of rites of passage anymore, like the sort of things that you hear about in the old world, and for what I understand, rites of passage have 3 phases. The first phase is separation from the known and familiar world. And usually in the old world, it was like a very dramatic sort of separation. Like you're at home chilling with your mom and comfortable, and then you're like kind of ripped out of the house and brought to the forest by the senior men in the village or in the community, like by force. And it's already kind of like a traumatic experience, but it's a meaningful traumatic experience, and a traumatic experience that's also necessary because to change sort of the approach toward reality, which is when you're like in the house with the mom. And I don't want to say with the mom and dad, but when you're starting off from ground zero, familiar ground security, the concept where everything's provided for you, the concept is life is meant for enjoyment. You throw your underwear on the ground, your mom comes and picks it up, unless she's black. Then she picks up something else like a belt. But it's like you have your mom, she's serving you, she's feeding you, everything is just provided for you in this like secure space. And so in the older rites of passage, you're kind of forcibly brought out of that security to some unknown territory by the senior man. The experience of that is quite traumatic, and it immediately changes your paradigm that life is not meant for being, I'm not meant for being served, but rather life is actually suffering, and I need to learn how to adapt myself to the reality. This is like the first stage of the rite in the old world, as far as I understand it. And then during the initiation process of the rite, maybe the older men, they like give you wounds, like meaningful wounds, to prepare you for the major wounds that you will experience in your life. Along with getting those wounds, you also get like different skills. So I'm kind of thinking of like old America, Boy Scout. I never did Boy Scout because we didn't have enough money for Boy Scout. But I had a lot of friends who did Boy Scouts, and they kind of would tell me how it was, and they learned different events, they learned different skills, have really wonderful events, and they also experienced something like some struggle. And then they would come back home kind of regenerated, having experienced the trauma of separation, having experienced the wounds of initiation. They kind of carry those wounds into this regenerated life, and they can prosper. So I feel like we don't have rites of passage. Like I don't remember experiencing like a rite of passage until adulthood. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to bring out here is that there's been a lack of obligation to grow up. And without that lack of obligation and that pressure to do it, then it seems very difficult to just on our own enter into that. So I feel that for a personal experience, and just as a general rule of thumb from my observation, this is largely attributing to the stagnating and personal growth from adolescence to adulthood. Would you agree with that, and why? Like, I guess, have you experienced any rites of passage I can say I've experienced one. I'll get to that later. But have you experienced any rite of passage as I'm describing it? Or do you feel that there's also been a lack of obligation and therefore you've been kind of caught in this quagmire of adolescence?
Pretty much not at all. I mean, it's like, but I've definitely very consciously thought about and seriously desired going to the military, you know, and like just for the sake of learning that discipline and that like just hardship and camaraderie and going through hardship together with others. You know, that's definitely something that I've been craving. And I mean, I had, in terms of like whether I've experienced it at all or not, I'll go back to school days, and I would say that there were two experiences that I could almost say kind of touches on some sort of a rite of passage, but not really to any like truly significant extent. When I was in school, I played water polo. That was my most that was kind of like my main sport, and I was pretty good at it. So when we were training for what we call, like here we call it the first team, so that would be like the top team in the school. When we were in the training squad for that, we would have like these training camps at the beginning of the year to get us like as fit and strong and skilled as we could possibly be. And that was like, it was super hardcore. It was like, you know, 5 hours of training every day for a week, you know, and you really have to, you know, you really have to give it your all, because it really takes everything from you. And there are moments where you feel like, you know, you want to fall over. It's that intense. But then you have to push through because you're there and you're surrounded with other guys going through exactly the same experience. And that's like really a powerful thing, to just have that sense of camaraderie. So, you know, that's something that I vaguely remember as being like sort of touching on a rite of passage experience. And then one other thing is, at the beginning of our final year of high school, our entire grade, I went to an all-boys school, and there was this, there was kind of like this weekend away, or maybe it was like 3 or 4 days, where we went to this sort of like boot camp kind of place, and we had all these like, we were split up into teams, and we had these like pretty serious physical challenges that we had to do, you know, just for the sake of like building some team spirit and building, I guess, to generate that experience of going through hardship together and being like connected in that experience. And I also remember like that as being something really meaningful. It was hardcore, but it was something which I was relishing it as I was going through it, you know. And I think like that, you know, so that relates to this, and it's still something that I think about even today, is just, you know, going to some place and like enrolling in like a martial arts school, you know, like the what do you call those Buddhist monks that are like serious into martial arts? What are they called again?
I don't know, Shaolin.
Exactly. You know, go and be like a Shaolin monk for like a year or something, you know, just for the sake of like going through that thing and accepting that hardship. It's a craving. But I'm 27 and I feel like it's too late, you know? So
interesting. I want to get back to that. It's an interesting comment that you
just getting, you know, just sort of like getting back to it. I feel it wasn't there. And when I say it wasn't there, like that experience of like being forced to grow up through circumstances, it's just never really been necessary, because I've just been so like almost absurdly comfortable my entire life, practically. And it's debilitating. It's debilitating. I've probably made this point a few times before, but it's really debilitating. And like when you're conditioned into it, into being so comfortable for so long, it's like really hard, you know, to self-generate the willpower to snap out of it feels impossible. You know, it's like you need circumstance to force you out of it. At least that's what I think.
Harley James has a comment about that. I'm going to get to it, but first I'm going to hear from Kishore on this point. Any rites of passage growing up, or anything that you could identify as a rite of passage? And do you think the lack of them or the presence of them has contributed to your experience in moving past the threshold of adolescence to adulthood?
I can think of some. They were kind of later in my life. Like the first one I can think of was when I went to India for the first time by myself. I was 18, so it was like, I was 18. I was kind of an adult, at least age-wise, and that was pretty life-changing for me. That was kind of my first experience of really being on my own and having to make my own decisions. And I was staying in the ashram, but it was like there wasn't someone like on your back all the time. It was quite free in that sense. You could really choose what you wanted to do. And we also had the responsibility of our seva, our kirtan service to the temple. And I think that was a really good experience for me because I did learn a lot of things like camaraderie. You had your shift, and there was guys who were on the shift with, and you're all responsible to each other, and that, and you had to live with each other every day, and so and how you spend how to spend your money. I had like pretty harrowing experience with my visa situation. It's just like all these different kinds of things, which kind of forced me to really think about the decisions I was making, choices that I was making. So it was a kind of exposure in that sense, and it was kind of like it was kind of like it wasn't necessarily as intense as like a proverbial uh, rite of passage would be, because I liked being in India, So, but that kind of independence was very helpful for me. And then I think also being when I came back to New York and I was staying in the Harinam ashram, and again it's like we were doing 6 hours kirtan every day, but we had a lot of responsibility. We had to cook for ourselves. We had to manage the money ourselves. We had to make sure that everything was on time. We had to make sure we had all the stuff that we needed. We had to like divvy up the responsibilities amongst ourselves. Who was going to do what and when. And I think that was probably one of the most powerful experiences for me also, because it was like you're out there in the subway and it's freezing cold and your fingers are bleeding from playing mridanga.
Yes.
And your voice is out and you can't sing, but you have to sing because there's nobody else there. There's like 3 people. You have to sing for an hour, and it's just like, again, it's a more kind of safe context in one sense. In the association of devotees doing Harinam, there's, as Bhaktivinoda Thakur says, there's no safer place. But that kind of that kind of experience of exposure to the world and having to navigate, maintaining your sanity, living in New York City, while also having a responsibility of that service. And I think that was really an amazing experience for me. That gave me a lot of, I gained a lot out of it. And again, that camaraderie of having to work with others. Sometimes you fight and you have to figure it out, there was bed bugs. There was, interesting characters, coming in and out of the building.
Hare Krishnas have a knack for that.
Yeah, like sometimes the police would come and we'd have to deal with that. Sometimes we'd have to move in the middle of the Harinam and go to a different station. So it's just on a subtle level and it's in a more direct level, I guess. Also, you just learn a lot of things. There's a lot of opposition. There's some people who hate you for being there, and they come and they criticize you, or they scream at you, or they try to attack you. It's like so many things, So that kind of experience was for me very, very wholesome. It just exposed me to so many different kinds of elements of the world that I might never have experienced, staying where I am, staying where I was in Florida. I know I probably definitely wouldn't have experienced that. So I think that exposure was really important for me. And then obviously being in the Bhakti Center and having a whole another level of responsibility in that sense, and having to deal with the challenges that came with that. Yeah, I think those kind of three experiences or three periods of my life, again, they were quite late, in my life. So that's kind of a theme for me. It's like I tend to learn things quite late, which sometimes is frustrating, but what to do? Um, so I think that for me, were probably the biggest things that really helped me to kind of get a foot up, from kind of that disadvantage, so to speak. And I think also when I was a kid traveling, we would travel every summer on the boys' tour. We would travel around America. We would go to theaters and stuff. That was kind of the beginning of my reestablishment of my manhood, you could say. It's like we'd have to like we'd have to like take off our clothes, try to clean up after ourselves. We'd have services to do. We had uh, just things like that. When you have a schedule, you have responsibility. We got to go to this temple, help set up the Rath. So you just get a little bit of a sense of like, okay, I have some kind of capability, some responsibility to adhere to, some authority that's over me, that's making sure I'm like on top of my stuff. So I would say, yeah, those are kind of the main things for me.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're describing sounds to me like a rite of passage in the at least the structure of it. You're separated from your home, you're put into an unknown environment, you're given heavy responsibility, you encounter adversity, and all these things come to shape sort of a new person so that when you will return home at the end of the trip or the end of the break, you're kind of like a new person, kind of regenerated, and that it seems to have all the elements of a rite of passage. I just wanted to share Harley James has a comment here, which I thought was very nice. I thought the same thing about the military. It seems like we naturally want rites of passage in our lives, but we usually can't create them ourselves. And so this leads me to a comment that you made also, Corona Avatar, about it's too late. I feel like it's too late. So this I find to be a little extraordinary, and this is why I'm going to tell my story to set up my point here. I definitely went through a rite of passage. When I was 18, I joined the ashram. I was on my way to a successful dance career. At least that's what I tell myself. I was training in ballet and modern dance, and I was moving in the direction that I wanted to. I got into a really good school in New York for dance with Alvin Ailey. And, I really had this aspiration that I was going to be the next Black Baryshnikov. Not the next, the first Black Baryshnikov. Anyway, and then I met the devotees. I became really, into Krishna consciousness. And within 7 months after meeting the devotees, this crossroads came where I had an opportunity to join the ashram. And I decided to leave behind kind of my old ego, like entirely, and join the ashram. So everything that I was aspiring for, all my hopes, all my dreams, I literally severed them and joined the ashram, which I think that follows the pattern of a rite of passage. And I went into this unknown Hare Krishna world. And then I lived in the temple for 13 years, and I feel that I prospered. And the reason that I prospered, I like to say, is because I embraced the challenge of the unknown. And I wasn't like sitting back and reminiscing or feeling nostalgia about what I left behind. It was like a clean cut, and I moved forward. And it was very painful because I got old school training. So I don't know if y'all know about that, but that old school Hare Krishna training ain't no joke. Getting yelled at literally every single day for like the minutest of things. You would get just smashed. Like any modern person coming in a Hare Krishna movement, they can't handle that old school training for sure. So it was extremely intense. I was forced to go on book distribution 6 hours a day by force. 2 hours on the train station to the airport because I was an airport book distributor, and 2 hours back and 6 hours at the airport. So it was literally a 10-hour day. And the devotee that trained me up, in one sense, it was a little bit traumatizing, but the devotee who trained me up, he was very eccentric, and he would do things like read Bhagavad Gita on the train to the people. But before reading Bhagavad Gita, he would recite the Nishinga Kavacha to purify the ether. So as soon as he would start chanting the Nishinga Kavacha, people would get off the train. And then he would say to the people, now that the atmosphere has been purified, we will read from Bhagavad Gita. And then he would force me to do it. So these were a little bit traumatizing experiences. anyway, I'm having a little fun here, but just to share one story in this regard, it was New Year's Eve. We're coming upon New Year's Eve. It was New Year's Eve, and he's reading Bhagavad Gita on the train, and people are getting very frustrated. It's like a crowded train. People are coming home from work. They're frustrated. And one person just starts snapping off, telling him to stop reading. So he asked the entire train, who here does not want to hear Bhagavad Gita? So the entire train raised their hand. Like everyone on the train raised their hand. And he said, not enough. He continued reading Bhagavad Gita. So I had a lot of, that's just an example of the sort of experiences I was having as a new Hare Krishna, like a little bit traumatizing for the old ego, but it was a rite of passage. And I feel that I embraced it and I came out, I blossomed very wonderfully when I was in the ashram. Then in 2015, I had a transition period. Clearly, once you stay in a particular position for a certain amount of time, that becomes the new ordinary world. Right? You escaped one ordinary world to enter the unknown. But after you've lived in that unknown world for a while, that unknown world becomes the ordinary world. And therefore, it itself becomes a new sort of prison that you have to break free from if you want to continue to grow. And so I think a lot of people who've had ashram experience, they go through this experience where the ashram life served as a rite of passage at one point, and at a later point, it serves as a prison. And it actually obstructs their further growth. And so most of us, if we're not forced out of that position, we just simply die in the ashram, like die alone. No one cares about us. We don't even care about ourselves. So it's like a period that it's like a point where you have to break free. So I got to that point apparently in my own life. I didn't really recognize it as such, but I think retrospectively speaking, I got to such a point. And then I was forced out of the ashram. But the difference between when I joined the ashram, when I was forced out of the ashram, was that I didn't embrace the force into the new unknown territory. So it was like a new rite of passage was required for me to grow further, but I wasn't able to embrace it. And so I suffered a lot of setbacks because I wasn't ready to embrace this new adversity for my further growth and maturation. So coming back to what you said about, I feel that it's too late for me. I find that comment to be interesting because for my storyline and what I'm trying to develop here, the idea is that growth is not like, it doesn't stop at some point. You know, at one point, you're breaking out of one prison and entering into a rite of passage so you can grow. And then you grow, you're regenerated. But after being regenerated, the new world becomes another prison that you have to break free from. So it's never really too late. Because we're always having to step out of our own way, so to speak, out of our own boundaries to continue further growth. So so this is kind of my point there. I even had a quote that I wanted to read from Joseph Campbell, but maybe I'll come back to that. So I guess my question here with this in mind, having recognized the need for crossing new boundaries for further growth, maybe this is a little bit personal, but what sort of proactive thing are you doing? Or let's say, would you recommend to someone to do? But maybe what you are doing yourself, and that's why you were recommended, to move forward and grow from this point that you're standing right now. Like if you're recognizing within your own life a sort of new prison of sorts that you need to break free from, what are the proactive engagements that need to take place for you from your own introspection so that you can break free from that prison? All right. So I spoke a lot there, but I wanted to give full context for why I was asking this question.
Right. So essentially, like what advice would we give ourselves, right? At this particular personal juncture in our lives where we are standing at this moment in time? Well, I'm really interested also to know Kishore's thoughts, because him and we're certainly in a very similar space. There are so many parallels between where we find ourselves in our lives. So like I feel where we're going to take this now is going to
Oh man, we're losing you a
Be
little
really
bit.
cool because I feel like whatever he says is probably going to apply to me.
Okay, what I got so far is Kishore, you go. That's what I got so far from the broken up. Kishore's gonna go and then you can double back.
Okay. Yeah, great question. Um, I think the main thing for me is association. In the real sense, you know, I would kind of, the word that came to me was kind of self-exposure. You know, that you something that I'm doing. I'll speak personally right now. What I'm trying to do really hard is that self-exposure is allowing people into my life and allowing them to push me towards the capacity that I have, to the potential that I have. One of the biggest challenges for me right now is um, I kind of feel it's a really another rite of passage in a way, is to properly kind of honor myself. You know, right now I'm experiencing a probably one of the biggest challenges for me right now is trying to shake off this familiarity. I call it the familiarity of chaos. So, you know, the when you're growing up and you kind of have that internal turbulence of trying to understand yourself and understand the world. And I was talking with somebody the other recently, and they were telling me about how the brain wants uh, it wants like predictability. It wants a particular pattern. It wants something that it can follow. And so, if you live your life in a particular way, particularly subconsciously, how you think about yourself, how you think about your life and your abilities, it creates a samskar, or a pattern in your mind, and your behavior will reflect that pattern. So the turbulence that I experienced growing up, just from like trying to figure out my life, you know, I developed a very kind of like negative image of myself, and so that became the familiar mindset. And so it's like every time you reach a certain threshold of growth, you don't fully get there. You get like almost there, and you're like, well, I'm not so, you know, great, or whatever it is, that negative self-talk. So it's like when every time I would go through a rite of passage in my life, I would reach a certain threshold where it's like, okay, now you can grow to this level. But I wouldn't quite get there. I would kind of get like around it, but not over it, you know? It's like, say if you're running on one of those tracks where there's like those like bars that you have to jump over it. It's like if you try to run around it instead, you know, instead of jumping over it. But you
Right.
can't. You have to jump over it, otherwise you don't qualify. So I kind of feel like that. I've kind of like I keep reaching these thresholds, but not completely taking everything that I'm supposed to get out of that experience and carrying it with me. I kind of leave some behind because there's still this like negative psychology that it's just kind of self limitation. And so what I'm starting to do now is allow myself to have more exposure and association to, in a more intentional way. I've always had devotees around me my whole life. I remember I was thinking about this the other day. I remember hearing from Vaisheshika Prabhu, he said you should always be in association with devotees who are more advanced than you. And I was like, well, I kind of always had associations with devotees that are more advanced. I've always had that. But it was like I didn't actually take advantage of their association. You know, here and there, you know, you kind of like go and talk to them, and then you just kind of like go and do your own thing, and then you come back when you're suffering and be like, hey, I need some help. You know, so but you don't actually take all of it in, you know. And so what I'm trying to do now uh, is really like take advantage of that association to the highest that I can. And I feel like that for me is a real rite of passage, because it requires leaving behind this mentality that I've been attached to for years, you know. So it feels like a kind of self death, you know. It's a death to an identity that you're no longer in need of. Now it's time to relinquish it. Now it's time to let it go. But you've been so attached to it for so long that you're like, well, who am I if I don't have that? And so the importance, or the critical need of the association is that you have these people who are like, this is who you are outside of that. And as long as you're not in that association, you're not able to maintain that clarity of mind, because you're always going to keep reverting back to that negative mentality. So the importance of the association for me is like keeping those people who are like, no, this is who you are. So then it's like, okay, I can leave this behind because these people are saying this is actually who I am. So I feel like that's kind of the rite of passage for me right now. It's quite a huge thing, and it's like I'm also in my, I think I'm in my Saturn return this year or this period. No, since I turned 27.
That's bad, is it? I mean, I don't.
No,
Saturn return. Okay.
it's some people say it's bad, but um, from my understanding and kind of research, it's more about coming into really understanding yourself in a way of understanding what your limitations are. So there'll be many things that you want to do that you're not able to do because it's not within your kind of range. So it's more of a acceptance of your limitations in a way. So it seems negative, but it's more of like a sobering element. So, but yeah, so that's kind of, so I think my advice would be association in an intentional, purposeful, active, proactive, super proactive way. That you allow people into your life and you keep them in your life, because it's easy to kind of like you meet with somebody and then you kind of just you don't message them. They're busy, so that they're not gonna like check in on you anytime soon. So you're just like, all right, I'm gonna. So my kind of advice would be that it's that association, and also challenging yourself. Like when I go back to Michigan, I'm gonna start working, and I'm like, it's like I'll be working assisted living and taking care of people, which is a pretty big responsibility. So for me, sometimes I like freak out. And I'm like, oh my god, like I don't know if I can do this. But it's like I know I can do it. I have the capability. It's practically natural for me. So it's like that back and forth. That you keep kind of like you're trying to push to your potential, but that's that kind of self limitation. So challenging yourself, placing yourself in situations where you can be challenged to access your potential, which is important in terms of your environment, because you also don't want to put yourself in an environment where you're at a disadvantage, where you don't have none of your natural abilities are helpful, because then you're going to lose. So you have to be in a situation that challenges you to use your natural abilities to the fullest capacity. But in order to do that, it requires association of those people to push you and to keep you accountable also. I never really liked that word because it felt so invasive, but that's the reality. That's the need.
Beautiful. So your advice, I'm liking your language, so I just want to reflect it real quick or repeat it, amplify it. Basically, your advice to yourself is self-exposure, which you defined as allowing people into my life and allowing them to push me toward my potential. I'm sorry, I'm a mainstream example, but the first thing that came to my mind was the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And I have this image in my mind of Magneto when in one of the older X-Men, like when they're back in the 50s or something, and Magneto is training up the character's name is Banshee, I think. And Banshee, he uses supersonic sound from his mouth and he can use it to fly. So they're trying to train him to use it. So they bring him to like these little small little areas and like push him off. Not even push him, like tell him to jump. And he's not able to do it. Finally, they get to like a really high thing and he's not able to jump. So Magneto just like pushes him off and like forces him to use his ability to fly. I mean, that's probably not the best. It's not a spiritual example, but it was an example that came to my mind in the sense that allowing someone into my life and allowing them to push me. One thing that's associated with this Peter Pan syndrome, and I do have this in my notes, is that such persons who are afflicted with this syndrome, which sounds to me like literally everyone, but they value absolute autonomy and independence, and they don't like any restrictions being put upon them. They hate boundaries on their life in any sort of way. So we tend to not like these older figures to come into our life and push. So I really appreciate this idea, self-exposure as allowing people into our life and allowing them to push us. And also to break free of the familiarity of chaos. I think that's what you said. That's also very interesting. It's so interesting, like our ordinary world can be a chaotic one, and that's where we find our comfort. So much so that we actually resist peace. I really wonder sometimes, this is kind of a sidebar, but I really wonder sometimes with the modern sort of like reform movements that we see popping up like practically every other day. I really wonder if they would be happy if the world was suddenly to become peaceful. Like if there was like really like there was no racism to push against, there was no sexism, there was no this phobia, that phobia. It was just like all peace. Would they actually be happy? And I have an intuition that the answer would be no, because chaos becomes a sort of familiar, ordinary world that we're actually attached to, and it becomes hard to break out of that prison. So I just was really appreciating that. All right, Karuna, you got something on this?
Yeah. Just on what you just said, like I think the reason why we get so attached to chaos is because almost like the trauma of being immersed in chaos and feeling yourself incapable in that space to deal with what's happening around you, then automatically pushes you to take shelter of distractions, which are very much rooted in pleasure and indulgence, which is usually which is usually very destructive. But the thing is, those kinds of distractions tend to be so like sort of absorbing and almost like overwhelming to the consciousness that you become addicted to it, you know. But you know, you can't take shelter of those things in a justified way without having the intense chaos and disorder and like, you know, lack of personal capability. So it is required in one sense, but that is of course the most negative cycle that we could possibly be caught up in. And then just to relate to what Kishore said, and I'll keep it short because as I expected, I so much resonated with his point. And I think maybe by this point in time, it is possible that I am known for essentially community is like the answer to all questions in my mind. You know, having like a really good space in the association with people that you're really inspired by and that you really relate with, and that ultimately, you know, push you to be the best version of yourself. Like, I do feel like that is almost the answer to all questions for all of us to live the best life that we can. But now to bring it sort of like more specific is that I am finding that I require the association of senior people who see my potential and are able to engage me accordingly. Because I similarly, as Kishore said, you know, I get caught up in these like really negative mental loops of like self-doubt and just being super insecure about my own capabilities. And so, you know, having people who see your potential and who are then able to engage you accordingly is indispensable. And I think that that is something which most people need. Some people, you know, it is a Brahminical quality to be able to self-generate your own like positive engagement. But like true Brahmanas are really few and far in between these days. So therefore, I think most people need to be engaged appropriately, you know. And I think especially in these times, because I'm, you know, as I've said before, like a little comfort gremlin. So it's like I just don't have the capacity to self-generate like my own consistent, meaningful, progressive engagement. But if I'm plugged in to a greater system of meaningful conquest, of shared meaningful conquest, you know, and I have a role to play in that, then I feel like there's almost nothing that I can't do. And I think if those relationships, you know, if you're in the structure of community and you're in relationship to others who are able to engage you and see your potential, if those are like really like open, loving relationships in which you can fully express yourself, you know, that also really helps. And that sort of like brings me back to a point that I made in a previous podcast, that, you know, in the context of loving relationships, we will be naturally inspired to make any sacrifice, you know. And I think for us to become the best version of ourselves, we need to be sufficiently inspired in the context of a network of loving relationships. Yeah.
So similar answer. This leads me. Harley has This was brought up a little bit earlier, but I think it's relevant now. I'm seeing this point. I wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail after high school so that I can experience the transition point. In the modern world, we seem to be more alone in the way we grow up, as to being uplifted. And I think this very much relates to what you guys are specifically bringing out, which leads me kind of maybe to a final question of sorts that I have. Looking into the future, I mean, we're the next generation of older men. And I do personally feel, to some smaller degree, that the older generations may not have fully invested this like a sufficient amount of energy in the up and coming generations, so that we can build that self-confidence on things that you're talking about. And that, I'm not saying that as a like on a universal platform, but just there's a general sense of that as a whole, as YouTube and digital media has taken the place of these older mentors. It seems to be less and less of that happening. So looking into the future a little bit, as we're growing older, we're going to be the next generation of guys. What do you think we need to be doing to help the next generation, and then to kind of go through a rite of passage? Like, even if it's on a very small level in our own personal communities, in our own relationships around us, but what are things that we need to be looking out for, or looking to be doing, so that we can help the next generation go through these rite of passages that we may have missed out on, so that they don't suffer the losses that we've had to suffer because of not having that facility? Maybe it's just kind of it's hard to think about it because we're still in the midst of growing up and all of that. But yeah, that's the question, I guess.
I think the answer is much simpler than we think it is. At least that's coming to me now, is that I think yeah, and the word simple is the key word there. You know, I think we need to very seriously consider Srila Prabhupada's instruction of simple living and high thinking, meaning that we need to work very seriously on establishing communities, farming communities specifically, where we have more natural ways of engaging with life and engaging with the earth, and you know, just kind of like making a very conscious move to establish the space where our lifestyles are just way less artificial, because it's essentially technology and all of the comfort that it provides, which I think is spoiling men, young men, and everyone to a great extent. So if we can give the younger generation the opportunity to become a little bit more distanced from that through living more natural lifestyles, I think that's the best we could do for them. And the example is, you know, Bhaktivedanta Purna Maharaj's Gurukul in Mayapur. I don't know if you guys have ever like met any of those guys, but
yes,
you know,
I know several of them.
Yeah, and they're just like, man, like what true, like I've never met guys who are just more radiant and wholesome and just like in touch with themselves, and just like so, I'm just so inspired by them, and I think that they're shining examples of what I mean. So, you know, we need to duplicate that model as far and wide and as deeply as we possibly can, because then, you know, through living closer to nature, like I think those rites of passage will be automatic.
Nice. Kishore, you got something on this? We've talked a lot about this once in a car from Alachua to Orlando, if you recall.
Yeah, I remember that. That was a very profound discussion. Yeah. Now that you reminded me of that, yeah, I think that I think that obviously the Gurukul model is great. It's amazing, and I think it definitely works for many. I think in terms of the principles, there are principles there that I think are very important. Kind of, in a similar kind of fashion, I think there can be an importance in facilitating experiences, for the younger generation. That for me was probably one of the most important parts of my life that kept me going, I guess you can say, kept me inspired in my Christian consciousness, was having profound experiences. So the facilitation of experience, I think, is a huge element in in raising a younger generation, or looking after a younger generation, or protecting a younger generation, and so to speak, is a facilitation of experiences. And I can see that as well with like my younger brother. He went to India, stayed in Vrindavan for 4 months. He came with me to New York and stayed in the Harinam ashram for 6 months. And it was like in the winter, like in the beginning, he was totally miserable. I almost felt bad for bringing him there. I was like, oh my god, this is not a good idea, But then over time, he blossomed, and he really got into it. And I think that it really made a big difference for him. And he's much more industrious and confident and fearless, in making decisions and going out and having experiences, or stepping out of his comfort zone. He really has no comfort zone. He's just like, he'll go anywhere and do anything. So I think that that kind of experience is super powerful and very important for young guys who are not ready to like accept like the really hard structured life. They may not be there yet to like get up at the I'm not even doing that, so I can't really expect that from them. They do that at the same time every day, so I think unless you're on that level, it's kind of hard to ask that from others. But what you can do is facilitate experiences that will have a profound impact. And when you're young and your kind of psyche is malleable like that, it's very, very powerful. It really leaves a really big impression. But then it's like, once you have those experiences, there needs to be an environment in which those experiences, or those kind of, yeah, you can say the kind of fruit of those experiences can be preserved. And so that kind of comes into then, the lifestyle and also community. When we talk about having association, obviously it is also, those who are more advanced than us and seniors, but the most time we spend is with our peers. And so the trying to affect the how to say, increased quality of the time that we spend with our peers. So like now in Harmony Collective, with my peers, obviously we have a lot of fun, but we also do really cool stuff, like going out. When Purushottam, we went out and did Harinam every day on the campus. So it's like the quality of how you associate starts to increase. So it's not so much about like forcing each other to do things, but when you have that collective mindset of wanting to do something great, then it's easy. Then, for example, doing this podcast, we're all peers and we just want to do something cool like this. So we're doing it. Nobody forcing us to do it. There's no senior that's like beating us with a belt, telling us to like go out and make ourselves useful. We just wanted to do it, And so, but the reason why I've even come to the point of having the desire to do something like this is because of the previous experiences that I've had exposure to that left those impressions in my heart and in my mind. So I think we would have to move away from this kind of forced austerity. Although that, I think austerity is very, very important. That's something I'm also trying to embrace is the austerity of growth. You know, there's a power in that you feel when you experience that austerity and you allow yourself to experience that discomfort. I think for men, it's a very empowering experience. You know, to kind of be deprived of comfort and having to conquer that, you know, that insecurity and all those kind of things. So I really think facilitating experiences is probably the main thing, and then increasing the quality of how we associate with our peers. You know, so like I know so many of my friends are doing so many cool projects, you know, and it's just super inspiring for me, and and just kind of collaborating with each other and coming up with different ideas of how we can do this and do that. And you know, like my younger brother, he wants to start a Harinam, traveling Harinam, you know, and I'm just like, for sure, like do it, you know. So it's like that kind of thing, like and also like every time somebody has some desire, we should always encourage and appreciate their endeavor. And yeah, so that's kind of what comes to mind for me.
I want to acknowledge Ram Kishore Dasi. He liked the question. He says, I'm 55 and also did not have support in rites of passage from older generation. At least not healthy rites of passage. I'm trying to do that for the younger man I know, and he specifically points out his sons. Dhruva has a comment here, and this is kind of for me a synthesis of what I heard from both of you. Connection to what Karuna Prabhu is saying, if we are able to live the philosophy we claim to value, then by our sincere example as men, we will become attractive to the younger generation. And he follows it up with a sort of not forcing approach. Essentially, we can't force the younger generation into any rite of passage. However, if we act in a way that endears them, then they will be receptive. Yeah. I guess some final thoughts on that. Facilitating experiences. So that's basically what a rite of passage is. It's the experience of moving from the known to the unknown, and in the unknown arena being dealt basically hardships in order to reform the character. Spare the rod, spoil the child. We've heard this before. And I'll tell you right now from personal experience, my mom did not spare the rod. I actually thought she could have spared it at least a few times, but she didn't spare it at all. And I attribute most of my character development, all of my character development in my younger years because of that. And I actually love her because of that. I mean, I've talked about this with many of my close friends about getting that rod and how it was awesome and how wonderful it was. Retrospectively speaking, of course, during the time period, it was just like, what's wrong with you? Why you hate me? But retrospectively speaking, it was awesome. So just facilitating experience of moving from the known to the unknown and getting the rod of the hardships in the unknown world to reform the character. You kind of die ego death, you become regenerated. To that degree, I do feel there should be a little bit of push there, as we were saying. Not that one is allowed, like obviously once they're 18, or I think in Vedic standard 16, you did what you could do and, you know, over. From 0 to 5, Fondo, from 5 to 15, get it, the ride, and then 16 finished. So I do think there's some element of like force there that can be healthy. But in order for it to be healthy, I do, just to Dhruva's point and Karuna Avatar's point, if we're not existing in the natural environments in which austerity is a natural byproduct of such existence, then it's going to be, it seems that it would be almost nearly impossible to actually facilitate a healthy sort of experience by which the character can be reformed. And so we hope to do a lot more podcasts on this. This technology is creating a huge problem, and the development of basically everyone, I believe, at this point. And I think it's at this point apparent to probably most of us, especially spiritual practitioners, it's apparent. So unless we are committed to the more natural lifestyles, which our literatures are trying to, what's the word I'm looking for? Inculcate. Inculcate was the word I'm looking for. They're trying to inculcate these more natural lifestyles and mentality into us. It will be very hard to create that type of life experience, especially looking into the future, where things are locked down. So this is just me trying to synthesize everything that I just heard from you all. Having healthy experiences, but needing the rod of austerity for growth, which is easily facilitated in a natural arena. So definitely moving towards a more natural arena where there are smaller village-like communities seems critical in order to manifest a healthier transition from adolescence to adulthood. And not that you're like 55 years old and you're finally becoming an adult and it's time to die. So that's kind of what I'm hearing. I don't know, any final comments here from you guys? That's my final statement here and all I got on my question board here.
Yeah, I just obviously we have to walk the talk, you know, like obviously the most inspiring thing, like this, one of the sayings that I very much like is that, you know, you can't convince anyone of anything before you haven't inspired them. And so therefore, yeah, we have to walk the talk. But that is like the biggest difficulty, and I feel like that's what we're dealing with here, and I see that as my own biggest challenge. Anyway, Jai, I think that you brought everything together really nicely, and I think that we definitely had some really good discussion around this subject matter.
More to come, because I got a cool follow-up rites of passage topic, but you'll see when it gets released. We'll probably get a lot of people watching that particular one because of the subject matter. I have a comment here from Robert Brand. I'm really fascinated by your podcast and have great respect by what you say and how you see and experience life. If I compare my life growing up as a young man, I think I actually had a sort of carefree life in comparison with your generation. That is why I have such great respect for how you handle, see, and experience life. Yeah, in one sense, the older generations didn't have the same issues that we have. Technology has changed the landscape so profoundly that it's complicated things quite a bit. So it's new territory for everyone, really, in that sense.
I just want to say, well, firstly, you know, it was a simpler life that they lived in many ways. But I also just want to point out that Robert is actually Hari Vilas's dad, for anyone that doesn't know.
Yes.
And he's one of our great heroes, because Hari Vilas is one of our great heroes, and he's also just a great guy in his own right. So shout out to Robert.
All right, fam. Thanks for joining us, and for those who joined live and for those who are here later, thanks to you also. Make sure to give a like on our podcast on Spotify and Apple and all other podcasting platforms. I guess it helps the algorithm. I don't know if it helps the algorithm, but I hear all the YouTubers saying that, so I'm just saying the same thing. Definitely give us a follow on Instagram. We're SSAT. I'm trying to change the name, but I'm having internet connection. So for now, you can give us SSAT Sangha, Sat Sangha on Instagram, and send us a DM there. We have a good year coming up for you guys in terms of programs we're offering in order to help us become the sort of men that we can admire. So if you're interested in connecting to that, definitely hit us up, and we'll definitely get back to you and help you join the resurgence of the primordial masculine. All right, I'll stop joking around. So thank you all again for tuning in, and see you all next podcast. Thank you, Karuna. Thank you, Kishore Gopal. Always a pleasure to have you. Hari Om Tat Sat.